The hardest goodbye is the one that the other person never sees coming. Morning sunlight spilled across the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hayes Global Tower as New York awakened beneath a clear autumn sky. Inside the executive offices, assistants hurried through quiet hallways preparing schedules for another demanding day while the city's most influential business leaders waited for a press conference that had already begun making headlines across the country. Alexander Hayes, the man newspapers often described as the coldest mafia boss in America, stood before dozens of cameras with his usual calm expression. He rarely gave interviews, rarely smiled, and almost never allowed his personal life to become public conversation. That morning, however, one unexpected announcement echoed through every news channel before the hour was over. Alexander Hayes was officially engaged. Applause filled the conference room as reporters rushed to capture photographs, investors congratulated him, and business partners celebrated what they believed would become one of the most powerful alliances in the city. Only one person quietly walked away before the celebration ended. Emma Brooks returned to the executive office she had managed for nearly 8 years and gently closed the door behind her. Her hands remained steady as she opened the top drawer of her desk and removed a neatly folded envelope she had prepared months earlier but never expected to use. She had spent years standing only a few steps behind Alexander, organizing every meeting, remembering every important date, anticipating every decision before he spoke it aloud, and protecting the quiet order of a life that always seemed too busy for personal happiness. Somewhere along those years, admiration had quietly become love, but she had never allowed herself to believe those feelings belonged anywhere except inside her own heart. Now the announcement had answered every question she had never been brave enough to ask. With one slow breath, Emma signed the final line beneath her resignation letter, placed it inside a simple envelope, and carried it into Alexander's private office. The room was empty. Sunlight reflected. Across the polished walnut desk where she carefully laid the envelope beside the morning briefing he always reviewed before noon. She looked around one final time. Every shelf, every calendar, every perfectly organized file carried memories no one else would ever recognize. A faint smile crossed her face, not because leaving felt easy, but because loving someone sometimes meant quietly stepping aside when their happiness seemed to belong elsewhere. Without leaving a note beyond her formal resignation, Emma collected the few personal belongings from her office, thanked every coworker who crossed her path, and walked toward the elevators without drawing attention to herself. 20 minutes later Alexander entered his office after the endless interviews had finally concluded. He loosened his tie, reached for the day's schedule, and immediately noticed the envelope resting at the center of his desk. His expression remained unreadable as he opened it and read the single page inside. For the first time in years, complete silence settled over the executive floor. Alexander pressed the intercom only once. "Where is Emma?" The assistant hesitated before answering. "She already left the building, sir." Alexander stood motionless for only a heartbeat before picking up his phone. His voice remained calm, but something unfamiliar had entered it. "Find her. She is not leaving." Emma did not answer the dozens of missed calls lighting up her phone as she walked through Midtown Manhattan with a small box holding the few personal belongings she had kept inside her office for nearly 8 years. The city moved around her with its usual restless energy, but every familiar street felt strangely different. For the first time since joining Hayes Global, she had nowhere she needed to be before sunrise the next morning. She had made the decision with a clear mind, yet every step away from the tower felt heavier than she had expected. Across town, Alexander Hayes remained standing beside the window of his executive office, the resignation letter still resting in his hand. 8 years. Emma Brooks had never once arrived late, never forgotten an important meeting, never broken a promise. And never asked for recognition beyond the opportunity to do her work well. She knew the names of every client, remembered every anniversary connected to the company, anticipated schedule changes before they became problems, and somehow managed to bring order to a life that often felt impossible to organize. Alexander realized something unsettling. He could remember countless successful negotiations, major acquisitions, and international meetings, but almost every memory included Emma somewhere quietly in the background. His longtime chief of operations, Daniel Carter, stepped into the office after receiving the unexpected order to find her. "We located Miss Brooks," Daniel said. "She went home. She is not trying to disappear." Alexander nodded but did not relax. "Cancel every interview this afternoon." Daniel looked surprised. "The media is waiting downstairs. They can wait longer." Daniel hesitated before asking, "Is this because of the resignation?" Alexander folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his desk instead of throwing it away. "Emma has never made an emotional decision. If she resigned today, something important changed." Meanwhile, inside her modest apartment overlooking a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood, Emma carefully packed several books, framed photographs, and office keepsakes into moving boxes. Weeks earlier she had accepted an offer from a respected nonprofit foundation in Boston. She had planned to decline it if nothing changed in her heart. After the engagement announcement, however, accepting the position seemed like the healthiest decision she could make. She could not continue spending every day beside the man she loved while preparing meetings for his future wedding. She quietly opened her laptop and sent a polite acceptance email confirming her new position would begin in 2 weeks. Closing the computer, she looked around the apartment where so many evenings had been spent reviewing Alexander's schedules long after business hours ended. She smiled sadly. "It is time," she whispered to herself. Back inside Hayes Global Tower, Daniel returned carrying another folder. "There is something else you should know," he said. Human Resources confirmed that Emma has turned down 5 promotions from other companies during the last 6 years. Every offer included higher salaries and better titles. Alexander slowly lifted his eyes. "Why?" Daniel answered honestly. "She never gave a reason." Silence settled across the office once again. Alexander looked toward the empty desk outside his office where Emma had worked every weekday for nearly 8 years. For the first time, he noticed how unusually quiet the executive floor had become, and although he still believed the engagement announcement had nothing to do with business, he could not ignore the growing feeling that Emma's resignation had everything to do with him. The following week passed with a quiet tension that settled over Hayes Global Tower like an approaching storm. Emma continued reporting to work because company policy required a 2-week notice before a resignation became official, but everything between her and Alexander had changed. She no longer entered his office with the easy confidence built through 8 years of working side by side. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact lasted only seconds before she politely looked away. Every schedule was perfectly organized, every meeting flawlessly prepared, yet an invisible distance now existed where effortless understanding had once lived. Alexander noticed every small difference even though Emma never gave him a reason to question her professionalism. His morning coffee still appeared on his desk exactly at 7:30. Important files still arrived before he requested them. Every conference call remained flawlessly arranged. Yet the familiar warmth that quietly filled his office each day had disappeared, replaced by careful formality. One afternoon he looked up from reviewing contracts and realized Emma had stopped reminding him to take lunch. It was a habit she had never forgotten in 8 years. Hours later, as he finally stepped outside his office, he found her helping a new assistant understand the executive filing system with the same patient kindness she had always shown every employee. She smiled politely when Alexander approached, but the smile never reached her eyes before she returned to her work. That evening another headline about Alexander's engagement spread across financial news networks, accompanied by photographs from the announcement several days earlier. Emma happened to see one of the articles while organizing presentation materials for the next morning. She quietly closed the browser window without finishing the story. Across the office, Alexander noticed the brief movement but misunderstood it completely. He assumed she simply disliked unnecessary media attention surrounding the company. What he failed to see was the quiet sadness she carefully hid behind years of practiced composure. Later that night, Daniel Carter entered Alexander's office carrying several documents requiring approval. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated before speaking. "Sir, may I ask you something?" Alexander nodded. "Have you ever wondered why Miss Brooks memorizes your schedule instead of checking her calendar?" Alexander looked up with mild curiosity. Daniel continued, "She remembers your meetings, your preferred flights, your favorite coffee, your mother's birthday, every anniversary connected to the company, and somehow even the days when you forget to rest. Nobody asked her to learn those things." Alexander remained silent. Daniel smiled faintly. People only pay that much attention to something they truly value. After Daniel left, Alexander found himself staring through the glass wall separating his office from Emma's now nearly empty workspace. He noticed the small potted plant she watered every Monday morning, the framed photograph of her late grandfather beside her computer, and several shelves that had already begun looking strangely bare as she quietly packed pieces of her life away one box at a time. For reasons he could not explain, the sight unsettled him far more than the resignation letter itself. He suddenly realized that for 8 years he had believed Emma would always be sitting at that desk every morning when he arrived, and now, for the first time, he was forced to imagine the office without her. The thought lingered long after the lights across Manhattan began glowing outside the windows, and somewhere deep inside, a question quietly formed that Alexander Hayes could no longer ignore. Why did losing Emma feel so much more frightening than announcing an engagement that had never touched his heart? The next morning began with an unfamiliar silence inside the executive floor of Hayes Global Tower. Emma arrived before sunrise as she always had, carrying a small notebook and a paper cup of coffee, but this time the routine felt temporary instead of permanent. Only 4 working days remained before her resignation became official. She quietly organized Alexander's calendar, confirmed his afternoon meetings, and placed a detailed transition binder neatly on the corner of his desk. Every document another assistant might need had already been labeled with remarkable precision. She intended to leave nothing unfinished behind. When Alexander entered the office, he immediately noticed the thick binder resting beside his computer. "What is this?" he asked. Emma answered calmly, "Everything someone will need after I leave. Meeting schedules, client preferences, travel arrangements, emergency contacts, and annual reminders." Alexander opened the first page and discovered that she had anticipated situations months into the future. Every detail of his professional life had already been prepared. He looked toward her. "You have already trained my replacement?" Emma nodded gently. "She is learning quickly." Alexander closed the binder without another word, but something inside him felt unexpectedly unsettled. Throughout the morning he found himself reaching for Emma almost automatically. He asked about a contract deadline before remembering she had already written the answer inside the binder. He searched for a meeting update only to discover she had anticipated his question hours earlier. Everything continued functioning perfectly, yet nothing felt right. During lunch he walked past the executive workspace and paused outside Emma's office. The shelves that had once displayed books, framed photographs, and small souvenirs collected during business trips now looked almost empty. Only her grandfather's photograph remained beside the computer monitor. Alexander quietly stepped inside. After knocking on the open door, Emma looked up from reviewing financial reports. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He glanced around the room before answering. "It already looks like you are gone." Emma smiled politely, though sadness lingered behind her eyes. "I thought making the transition easier would help everyone." Alexander studied the half-packed boxes resting against the wall. For years he had walked past them without truly seeing the person who occupied this office. Now every missing object seemed impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon Daniel Carter entered with several documents requiring signatures. Before leaving, he casually mentioned that Emma had declined another executive position only a few months earlier. It would have doubled her salary, Daniel explained. She thanked them for the opportunity and stayed here instead. Alexander looked up immediately. Did she ever explain why? Daniel shook his head. No. She only said there was still someone she could not leave behind. Those words remained with Alexander long after Daniel disappeared down the hallway. As evening settled across Manhattan, most employees returned home, but Alexander remained standing alone outside Emma's office. Through the glass wall he watched her quietly place another framed photograph into a moving box before switching off her desk lamp. For the first time in 8 years, he imagined opening his office door the following Monday and finding that chair permanently empty. The thought settled heavily in his chest, and although he still could not understand the true reason behind Emma's decision, he finally admitted to himself that losing her felt far more personal than losing the most trusted employee he had ever known. The final morning of Emma's notice period arrived beneath a gray New York sky, and Hayes Global Tower felt strangely quieter than usual. Employees greeted Emma with warm smiles, thanking her for years of guidance while quietly wishing she would change her mind before the day ended. She accepted every kind word with genuine gratitude, but her decision remained unchanged. The acceptance letter from the nonprofit foundation in Boston rested safely inside her briefcase, and her flight was scheduled for the following afternoon. She had already packed nearly everything waiting inside her apartment. All that remained was one final workday. Alexander arrived earlier than anyone expected. Instead of walking directly into his office, he paused beside Emma's nearly empty workspace. The familiar shelves now held only a desk lamp, a calendar turned to its final page, and the framed photograph of her grandfather. He realized he had never asked about the smiling older man whose picture had quietly watched over the office for years. Was he important to you? Alexander asked softly. Emma looked toward the photograph with gentle affection. He raised me after my parents passed away. Everything good I know about loyalty, patience, and keeping promises came from him. Alexander nodded thoughtfully before returning to his office, carrying those words with him. Later that afternoon, Daniel Carter requested a private meeting. As soon as the office door closed, Daniel placed a small envelope on Alexander's desk. I found this while helping Human Resources organize Emma's personnel file. Alexander opened it carefully. Inside rested several recommendation letters from prestigious companies dating back almost 7 years. Each offered Emma executive positions with significantly higher salaries, expanded responsibilities, and opportunities most professionals would accept without hesitation. Attached to every letter was the same handwritten response thanking the company for its confidence before respectfully declining the offer. Alexander read them one after another until he noticed something else folded beneath the final page. It was a retirement card signed by dozens of employees after the company's former receptionist had left years earlier. Among the handwritten messages, Emma had written only one sentence. Sometimes the people who matter most never realize how much of their world they quietly become. Alexander stared at those words for several long moments. Daniel remained silent before finally speaking. There is one more thing you should know. Alexander slowly lifted his eyes. Last night I spoke with Olivia Grant. She and Emma have been close friends since college. Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Olivia told me Emma stayed here because she loved someone she believed she could never have. She never expected that person to return her feelings. She simply wanted to be close enough to know he was doing well. Silence filled the office. Alexander did not ask who that person was because, deep inside, he already knew the answer before Daniel quietly added, "She has loved you for years." The words settled heavily inside the room as every memory from the past 8 years suddenly looked different. Every perfectly prepared meeting, every reminder to eat lunch, every birthday remembered, every quiet smile, every promotion declined, and every ordinary morning now carried a meaning he had never stopped long enough to understand. As evening approached and Emma quietly switched off the light inside her office for what she believed would be the last time, Alexander remained standing alone beside the window, finally realizing that the resignation letter had never been the true loss waiting in front of him. The real danger was letting the woman who had silently loved him for years walk away without ever hearing the truth hidden inside his own heart. Alexander Hayes did not sleep that night. Long after the lights across Manhattan faded into the darkness, he remained standing inside his office overlooking the quiet city, replaying every conversation he had shared with Emma during the past 8 years. Until that afternoon, he had believed those memories were nothing more than ordinary moments between an employer and his most trusted executive assistant. Now every memory carried an entirely different meaning. He remembered the mornings she quietly placed coffee on his desk before he arrived, somehow always knowing exactly when another difficult day awaited him. He remembered the evenings she stayed late without complaint whenever unexpected negotiations extended into the night. He remembered every birthday card signed on behalf of the company that somehow contained words perfectly suited to the person receiving it. He had always admired her professionalism. He had never stopped to ask what kind of heart made such consistency possible. As dawn approached, Alexander reached a decision that surprised even himself. Before the executive board assembled for the morning meeting, he requested a private conference with the family whose daughter had been announced as his fiancée only days earlier. The engagement, arranged months before to strengthen a long-standing business alliance, had never been built upon romance. Both families respected each other, but neither Alexander nor his fiancée had ever spoken about love. When they met inside a quiet conference room, Alexander chose complete honesty. "I owe you an apology," he said calmly. "I agreed to something because it seemed practical, not because it reflected what I truly wanted." The young woman sitting across from him smiled with unexpected understanding. "I was hoping you would say that." Alexander looked at her with quiet surprise. She continued gently, "I accepted the arrangement because our families expected it, but I have always believed marriage should begin with genuine affection. We both deserve that opportunity." The conversation ended with mutual respect instead of disappointment. Before noon, both families formally agreed to end the engagement without conflict, protecting their friendship while allowing each person to follow a more honest future. News of the cancelled engagement spread quickly through the executive offices, leaving employees confused by the sudden change. Emma, however, never heard the announcement. She had already completed her final morning at Hayes Global, handed her security badge to Human Resources, and quietly returned to her apartment to finish packing for Boston. She believed the chapter of her life connected to Alexander had already ended. Inside the nearly empty apartment, cardboard boxes lined the living room while one suitcase rested beside the front door. Emma carefully folded the last sweater into place before pausing to look around the home she would soon leave behind. There was sadness, but also peace. She had chosen distance because she believed it was the kindest decision for everyone involved. Across the city, Alexander stood beside the window of his office holding Emma's resignation letter one final time before carefully folding it and placing it inside his jacket pocket. Daniel Carter entered moments later. "The engagement has officially ended," he confirmed. Alexander nodded quietly before picking up his car keys. "Good." Daniel studied him for a moment. "Where are you going?" Alexander looked toward the Manhattan skyline with calm certainty. "For 8 years Emma was always the one who came looking for me whenever I needed something." A faint smile appeared across his face. "Now it is my turn to find her before she leaves New York." The next afternoon, John F. Kennedy International Airport buzzed with the familiar rhythm of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and hurried travelers moving toward departure gates. Emma Brooks stood near a large window overlooking the runway, holding her boarding pass for the flight to Boston while the small carry-on suitcase beside her contained everything she had decided to bring into the next chapter of her life. Her apartment had already been vacated that morning. The keys had been returned. Hayes Global Tower now belonged only to memories she intended to leave behind. She took a slow breath, reminding herself that walking away did not mean the past had been meaningless. Sometimes loving someone also meant accepting that they were meant to build a future without you. Several miles away, Alexander Hayes drove through Manhattan traffic with a determination that surprised even Daniel Carter, who sat silently in the passenger seat. For years, Alexander had never rushed anything. Every negotiation, every business decision, every public appearance had been measured with careful patience. Today was different. He checked the time again before looking toward Daniel. Has she gone through security? Daniel glanced at the latest message on his phone. Not yet. She is still inside the main terminal. Alexander nodded and pressed forward. Minutes later he stepped into the crowded airport, drawing curious glances from travelers who recognized the influential businessman but sensed that today he had little interest in public attention. His eyes searched the terminal until they finally found Emma standing quietly near the departure gates, watching airplanes lift into the afternoon sky. For a brief moment he simply stood there, realizing how close he had come to losing the one person who had quietly become part of every ordinary day in his life. Emma noticed him only after hearing her name spoken in a voice she had never expected to hear inside an airport. She turned slowly, genuine surprise filling her blue eyes. Mr. Hayes? Alexander walked toward her without hesitation. Please, he said softly. Today, call me Alexander. Emma looked at him in confusion. Why are you here? He stopped only a few feet away. Because I finally understood something far too late. She lowered her eyes gently. Your engagement changes nothing about my decision. Alexander shook his head. There is no engagement anymore. Emma looked back up, unable to hide her surprise. Before she could ask another question, Alexander continued. It ended this morning because it never belonged to my heart. The busy terminal seemed to fade into the background as boarding announcements echoed overhead. Emma searched his face, trying to understand what had changed so suddenly. Alexander took another careful step forward, not to pressure her, but to speak with complete honesty for the first time. When I found your resignation letter, I believed I was losing the best executive assistant I had ever worked with. Then I realized I could replace a position, but I could never replace the person who filled it. Emma felt tears gathering despite every promise she had made to herself to stay strong. Alexander smiled with quiet sincerity. I told everyone you were not leaving because I thought I needed you in my office. He paused before gently adding the truth he had finally discovered. Now I know I simply do not want my life to continue without you in it. Emma stood motionless as the sounds of the airport continued around them, yet everything beyond Alexander's voice seemed to disappear into the distance. Travelers hurried toward departure gates, children laughed beside large windows overlooking the runway, and boarding announcements echoed through the terminal, but for the first time in years neither of them seemed to notice anything except each other. Emma lowered her eyes, trying to steady the emotions she had spent 8 long years carefully hiding. Alexander, she whispered softly, the unfamiliar use of his first name making both of them pause for a brief moment, you do not have to do this because I resigned. He shook his head immediately. I am not here because you resigned. I am here because your resignation forced me to see everything I should have understood long ago. Emma looked at him with quiet uncertainty. You are only feeling this because everything changed so suddenly. Alexander smiled gently. That is what I believed at first. He glanced toward the busy terminal before continuing. Then I walked through my office after you packed your things. I realized every part of my day carried your influence. You remembered details I never noticed. You protected time I never valued. You reminded me to rest when I forgot. You celebrated every success without asking for recognition, and somehow I convinced myself those things simply happened on their own. Emma felt tears gathering despite her efforts to remain composed. I never expected you to notice, she admitted. I did not do those things hoping you would love me. Alexander took another careful step forward. I know. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. That is exactly why they mattered. Emma smiled sadly. When the engagement was announced, I realized I had reached the point where staying beside you every day would only make it harder to let go. Leaving was never meant to punish you. It was the only way I knew how to protect my own heart. Alexander nodded with complete understanding. If our situations had been reversed, I would probably have done the same. The honesty between them removed years of misunderstanding in only a few quiet moments. Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded the resignation letter she had placed on his desk several days earlier. The paper had already become slightly worn from being opened countless times. I have read this letter more often than any contract I have ever signed, he admitted with a faint smile. Every time I read it, I realized it never explained why you were leaving. I had to discover that by looking at my own heart instead. Emma laughed softly through her tears. You always did solve difficult problems eventually. Alexander laughed with her, a warm sound that surprised several nearby travelers who recognized him from the business world. He no longer cared who was watching. Emma, he said gently, I cannot ask you to erase 8 years of uncertainty with one conversation. I only want to ask for one chance. Stay because you want to stay, not because I asked you to. Let me earn the trust and happiness you have given everyone else for so many years. Emma looked down at the boarding pass resting quietly in her hand before lifting her eyes back to Alexander, realizing that the future she believed had already departed might still be waiting only a few steps away. Emma looked quietly at the boarding pass resting in her hand before slowly folding it in half. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt heavy with regret. Instead, it carried the fragile hope that appears only when two people finally stop hiding the truth from each other. A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, calling passengers for the Boston flight to begin lining up at the gate. Emma glanced toward the line forming a short distance away, then back to Alexander. She smiled through tears that no longer came from heartbreak alone. For 8 years, she said softly, I convinced myself that loving you from a distance was enough. I never wanted to become someone who expected something in return. Alexander stepped closer, careful to leave her enough space to choose freely. And for 8 years, he answered, I confused certainty with routine. I believed my life was simply organized well. I never realized it was organized by someone who cared about me every single day. Emma laughed gently. You really are late figuring things out. Alexander smiled in a way that no boardroom, business victory, or public celebration had ever inspired. I am. But I do not want to be too late. Emma slowly looked down at the boarding pass once more. Then, with calm confidence instead of hesitation, she placed it inside her handbag rather than handing it to the gate agent. I suppose Boston will understand, she whispered. Alexander let out a quiet breath he had not realized he had been holding. Does that mean you are staying? Emma nodded. I am staying because I want to see where honesty leads us. Not because you asked me to. Alexander's expression softened with unmistakable gratitude. That is exactly the answer I hoped for. Several months later, spring returned to Manhattan, bringing fresh sunlight through the windows of Hayes Global Tower. Employees noticed changes almost immediately. The executive floor still operated with remarkable precision, but it also carried a warmth it had never known before. Emma no longer worked as Alexander's executive assistant. Instead, she accepted a new role as executive director of the company's charitable foundation, leading community programs she had always dreamed of expanding. Alexander insisted that her promotion reflected her talent rather than their relationship, and everyone who had worked beside Emma knew he was telling the truth. She had earned every opportunity through years of dedication. One afternoon Daniel Carter entered Alexander's office carrying several contracts before stopping beside the walnut desk. Framed beneath a sheet of protective glass rested the resignation letter that had almost changed both of their lives forever. Daniel smiled knowingly. You kept it. Alexander looked at the letter before answering. It reminds me never to mistake someone's quiet presence for something that will always be there. Later that evening, Emma joined him beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, where countless lights stretched across the city below. Alexander reached for her hand with gentle confidence. "You once tried to leave because you believed there was no place for you beside me," he said quietly. Emma smiled as their fingers intertwined. "Now I know I was never standing behind your life." She looked out across the city before turning back toward him. "I was always meant to stand beside it." As the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, the resignation letter remained framed inside the office, no longer as a symbol of goodbye, but as a quiet reminder that sometimes the moment we fear losing someone forever becomes the very moment we finally discover where our hearts have belonged all along.